Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for session 2 of the Scholarly Summer Writing Institute on Write, Revise, Rinse, and Repeat, the Art of Self-Revising. So my name's Stacy Penna, and I'm the QSR Community Director, and I'll basically be the moderator and just helping behind the scenes. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over some of the different features of GoToWebinar to help you understand how you can participate. So first off, everyone is on mute because we have a large group attending, which is great. This has been a very popular institute. And if you want to ask a question, feel free at any time to just type in your question. If I can answer it, I will answer it. If it's for one of the presenters, then I will share it with them, so they'll help you answer it. Also, I have attached the handout, but I've been told you can't get to session 2 handout, so I'll keep trying. I'm not sure why it's not working, but don't worry, we'll send you the handout at some point over the next couple days if we're not able to download it. So we'll definitely get it to you. And this is being recorded, so we'll also be sending the recording out. We had so many requests to have the recording from yesterday's session that we'll try to get today's session out to you sometime tomorrow. So you will get the recording as soon as we can edit it and get it set up for you. So I just wanted to go over those different items, and now what I'll want to do is introduce our presenters to you from Dissertation by Design. So today the presenter is Jessica Parker, the owner and a coach at Dissertation by Design.
Thank you, Stacy.
Oops, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Oh, there you are, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Parker. Like Stacy said, I'm the founder of Dissertation by Design, and I'm really excited to speak to you today about the art of self-revising. My background, I'm a healthcare researcher. Prior to founding my business, I was a research director in Boston of several large-scale research grants at Harvard and Northeastern. And then I'm just really passionate also about bringing mindfulness into my work with graduate students. So you might notice how I'm going to kind of sneak that into today's presentation in certain areas. And I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Great, thanks, Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I'm trying to get back to my PowerPoint is not, so I'm going to get out and go to. And also, I just wanted to introduce our software experts. Get back to. So first for Satavi, Jennifer Schultz will be showing us how to use Satavi for revising.
Hey everyone.
And then for NVivo, Laura, who's one of our certified platinum NVivo trainers, will be showing how to use NVivo to help with your revising.
Hi everyone, Laura coming to you today from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in southern Alberta in Canada.
Great, thank you both. So for today's agenda, you can see that it's going to be around talking about, which I love this term, the shitty first draft, and create a writer's vision list, how to prioritize the revision process, organization, content, and editing. So that'll be Jessica. And then Jenny will go in and show us how to use Satavi to organize your draft and revision process. And then Laura will help with NVivo and how to organize your categories with your draft. And then we'll have questions at the end, but feel free again to type in questions at any point in the question area in the GoToWebinar menu. So with that, I'm going to make Jessica our presenter so she can take it away.
All right. Can everyone see my screen here?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. Just gonna zip right through this part. So let me just dive in with the learning objectives. We have 3 learning objectives today. My hope is that by the end of this webinar, you will better understand the role of revision in the writing process, also understand how to approach and prioritize revision. And then at the end, Jenny and Laura will help you apply these revision strategies using Citavi and NVivo. So let's get started. I want to first, before we dive into the art of self-revising, I think it's important to start by really understanding the relationship between writing and revision and editing and even pre-writing in order to be effective at revising. So when I was an undergraduate student, this was my writing process. I started with pre-writing. I would spend a little bit of time developing an outline and kind of planning. And then I would spend a lot of time kind of writing, revising, and editing all at once. Oftentimes I would sit down and start with the very first line of my introduction, and kind of forge on hell or high water to the closing sentence. And it was just really, really painful. It was a drawn out process. I often struggled with writer's block and procrastination because it wasn't enjoyable. And then as soon as I had a draft ready, I would then spend some time proofreading before sending it off for feedback. And as you can see here, the writing and revising and editing is done simultaneously, which I do not recommend. This is my relationship with writing now. As you can tell, it looks very different. When I was in graduate school, I had an amazing mentor who helped me rethink the writing process. And then over the years, through my work with clients and just doing my own writing, I've refined this process. And I think that this is a much more effective way to approach writing and revision. So as you can see here, if we compare these side by side, you'll see that I'm spending much more time in the pre-writing phase. I'm spending obviously a good deal of time doing the actual writing, but I'm not revising and editing as I'm writing. And then I take a break. I step away from my work for 2 or 3 days. And then I focus on revision and editing, which can take more time than the actual writing process itself. And this is iterative. So if you're drafting, if you're on your first draft, hopefully you'll have 2, 3, 4, even 5 drafts where you're going through writing and revision. And then at the bottom here, you can see in italics, this is all happening within what I call designated writing conditions. And funny enough, I never really called it that until recently, but apparently this is a term that's used that I wasn't aware of. So let's talk about what designated writing conditions are. Let's see. So first of all, I want to give credit to someone. So Erin, who was a prior member of my team, she was a creative writer and she wrote this amazing blog post for us on designated conditions. And so I'm taking that from the blog post, and throughout the presentation, you'll also notice that there's little check marks, and this is a resource. So this kind of signals a resource. So there's a link to the blog post there in case you were interested. But I want to use a quote from Erin before I kind of dive into reflection and repetition. So Erin says in her blog post, when it comes to working on a dissertation, the small choices we make about when, where, and how we write can add up pretty quickly to positively or negatively affect both our experience of writing or the writing itself. The key is harnessing the tandem powers of reflection and repetition. So with reflection, I want you to kind of ask yourself a question. What factors, whether it be time of day, location, clothing, writing medium, have often been present during my writing sessions that have allowed me to do most of my focused and productive writing? And then write down 3 or 5 factors that come to mind when you think about the last time that you were in what many people call a flow state, where you kind of lose sense of space and time. You look up and suddenly 4 hours have passed. What I started doing years ago, before I even called it designated writing conditions, is I started paying attention to those factors and conditions that were present when I got into a flow state so that I could try to repeat them as often as possible and try to recreate and recapture that flow state. So once you know your designated conditions, do your best to implement them regularly into your writing sessions, trying out different combinations as needed. And if you really commit to your designated conditions, you might be surprised at what happens to both your experience of writing and the writing itself. A sip of water here. So I thought it would be helpful to just share what my designated writing conditions are. And this has changed. When I was in grad school, I used to have to go into a coffee shop in order to get anything done. Now, especially during COVID, that wasn't possible. So a lot of people have had to make do with a home office. So my designated writing conditions for the past couple of years now are early morning. If I need to sit down and focus without any distractions, I have to do it in the morning. In my home office, where I have a desktop computer, it's really hard for me to get productive writing done on a laptop. Where I have 2 screens and a clean desk that's not cluttered, because the clutter will distract me. I like to have a lamp on, no overhead light. And I know that this sounds crazy, but it's very specific. And I encourage you to get just as specific with your designated writing conditions. I also like to keep it a cool temperature with a cozy sweater on, like to be comfortable. I have coffee and water on hand. I have an oil diffuser where I'll either add in eucalyptus or citrus oil. My phone is of course on silent and my email and notifications are turned off. I always begin with a clear goal. This is something that I talk to my grad students and our clients about almost every day, is setting a goal and an intention whenever you sit down to write. So you have a very clear focus. And then I love this app, it's called Focus at Will, where you kind of fill out a little survey and it chooses music, kind of background music, there's no lyrics, for your personality type. And I set a timer for 60 minutes. Some people might set a 30-minute timer, some people set a 10-minute timer. For me, I feel like I can convince myself to commit to writing for just 60 minutes if I'm having, some issues with procrastination. And then if the timer goes off and I'm miserable, then I give myself permission to walk away. But oftentimes, especially if I've recreated these conditions, when the timer goes off, I want to keep going. And so I encourage you to kind of take some time after today's webinar and reflect. Think about the last time you were in a flow state and you were highly productive when you were writing, and just kind of reflect, what were the factors and conditions that were present when that happened, and see if it's possible to recreate that in a space that you know that you can have access to frequently when you're writing. All right, so before we dive in to start talking about pre-writing and writing and revision, I want to do a quick poll. I want to hear from you. How often do you pre-write or plan and outline before you begin writing? Always, sometimes, never? Go ahead and complete that poll for me. Stacy's going to pop it up.
Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out the handout, so people be patient with me. I'm trying, but we'll get it to you. Don't worry. I know people are typing, then they can't get it, but we will get it to you somehow. Okay, here we go. Here's the poll. Okay, I'm going to close it in 5 seconds. And I'll share it.
Interesting. 32% always pre-write, 56% sometimes, 12% never. Okay, so hopefully by the end of the first half of this webinar, I've convinced all of you to begin pre-writing. Oops, the presentation went away.
Yeah, so it does seem to go back. Yeah, now we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, good. So let's talk about pre-writing and see if I can convince all of you to go into that always category when you're writing. So the reason I'm talking about pre-writing instead of just immediately honing in on revision is because it's really difficult to compartmentalize the writing process. I know a lot of people tend to think about these as very separate actions or practices, but they really all work together. It's a full writing experience, and I would even argue that effective revision begins with pre-writing. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with what pre-writing is. It's all about planning and outlining. And my pre-writing process involves developing a detailed outline with many, many headings. I'm going to show you an example in a moment. Keeping in mind that adding too many headings in the beginning is perfectly fine. Many of them often collapse during the revision process, but having those headings, those many, many subheadings for every idea that you can think of labeling as a heading, those give you an opportunity to really hone in on a goal when you sit down in the writing process. And under each heading, go ahead and write down the main idea you want to communicate in that section of writing. And keep in mind that this takes time. It should not be rushed. A lot of people like to rush the pre-writing process. I know sometimes I'll tell I had my doc students, they wrote a lit review last semester, and I had them post an outline. And some of them within 24 hours of me giving them the assignment would just immediately post an outline. And that's fine. Maybe you do have a crystal clear idea of how you want to organize either your thesis or your lit review or a manuscript. But if you're not sure, if you know that this is going to be kind of a new process for you, if you're learning something about a new topic, if you're a student in particular, then this should take almost just as much time as writing the first draft. So keep that in mind. It involves critical thinking, so it's challenging. Then when you have all of your headings laid out, you have your outline with your main ideas, some of your main topic sentences, then I want you to strategize. So a lot of times pre-writing consists of just the outline, but I also consider strategy to be a very important aspect of pre-writing. I want you to think about where will you begin. I want to challenge you not to start with the first sentence or the first paragraph. I find that incredibly stressful, especially I'm a perfectionist, so before I started this process of writing, I would agonize over the first paragraph. I would maybe spend like hours and hours trying to get it perfect before I could move on. So please don't do that. Start with what you know. I'm really big on building writing momentum by starting with what you know. So you might choose a heading in the middle of the paper. If you're working on a lit review, it could be in the middle of the lit review. Just start with what you know, what you're ready to dive in and start writing, and then go from there. Sometimes this means even starting with body paragraphs. You don't have to start at the beginning of a new section of material. Psychologically, this feels less stressful for me because, like I said, I tend to try to perfect those opening paragraphs. So during the pre-writing phase, I want you to reflect on, kind of lean into recognizing when you're feeling stressed and maybe start to strategize around that. So it does this does call for some self-reflection and some self-awareness. So here's a very simple example of an outline for not even a whole section, a partial section of a strand of literature in a lit review. So as you can see here at the top, the main heading of this strand is elementary school classroom structure. And there's two subheadings, self-contained and departmentalized classroom structure. I have a placeholder for the main idea under each heading, followed by several body paragraphs. And I know that when you're actually writing, it doesn't work out this perfectly with 3 paragraphs per heading, but this is just an example. So based on the pre-writing strategy that I discussed, I would start by thinking through the main idea for each section of writing, and I would choose one. In this case, let's say I'm most familiar of departmentalized classroom structure. So I might start there. I might start with the very first body paragraph. The key here is just having a plan. Don't just dive into the outline and feel like you have to start from the top and work your way through the bottom. It doesn't have to be that way. You can structure the writing process any way that you want, This is just what works really well for me. Okay, now we're going to talk about the shitty first draft. This is a term used by Anne Lamott in the book Bird by Bird. I love this quote. Almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting something, anything, down on paper. I don't know about you, but this has been incredibly challenging for me to embrace this idea of a shitty first draft. So let's talk about that for a moment. What does this really mean? Well, a member of my team, Dr. Michelle Morker, actually wrote a blog post, and she calls it the Bminus Work mindset, but it's the same type of idea. So you might hear me accidentally say Bminus Work. I include a link to that blog post in case you're interested. So when we talk about writing a shitty first draft, going back to my strategy in pre-writing, I'm tackling one section of writing at a time. And the goal here is just to get your thoughts and ideas on paper. You have to actively resist the urge to correct grammatical errors and typos, to perfect every sentence, to have these beautiful transition sentences. The goal is just to get your ideas on paper, and I love to do this through bulleted lists instead of writing full paragraphs, especially if you're prone to procrastinating. Psychologically, the idea of sitting down and thinking, I'm just going to create a list versus I'm writing can be extremely helpful. So I encourage you to maybe reframe your thinking, accept this idea that the first draft you create is going to be terrible, but that's okay because no one else is going to read it except you. And it takes the pressure off. It really speeds up the writing process. And it kind of delays that dread that tends to happen, especially for me. But I mean, so many people that I talk to who are even seasoned scholars and they're writing manuscripts, it's still hard to force ourselves to sit down and write. So embrace this idea of the shitty first draft. And I also encourage you to read Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, if you haven't, because the way she frames this shitty first draft is just incredibly helpful. Here's an example of, sorry, my mouth is dry, of a shitty first draft that it's actually just a very small portion of a lit review. I went back through my old drafts when I was writing my dissertation and I found this. As you can see here, these are bulleted lists. There's no transitions. There's no paragraphs. This is what it looks like when I sit down and just start drafting, getting my ideas on paper. I often do go ahead and add in citations, and that is easier if you're using a reference management software such as Satavi, which Jenny will talk to you about today. But this feels a lot easier to me than sitting down and thinking, I have to write this perfect paper. So I encourage you to do something similar. Okay, now we're going to dive into the meat of this presentation. It's about how to approach revision. So we're not actually revising just yet. We have our shitty first draft, and we've kind of gone from maybe bulleted lists to paragraphs, and it's at a point to where you need to start thinking about organization and the content and editing, and you're just approaching the revision process at this point. The first thing I want you to do is revisit your overarching argument. At some point, you created either a paragraph or a page, depending on what you're writing, a concise depiction of the problem you're planning to address through your research, and that is essentially your overarching argument. So for doc students, this could be your problem statement. If you're writing a manuscript, this is typically embedded in the introductory pages of the manuscript. Go ahead and revisit that and start there, because I want you to revisit that argument each time you sit down to write so that it's front and center. This will help keep you focused. It'll help remind you of the overall argument that needs to come through in your writing, regardless of what section of writing you're working on. And then, similar to how I said to approach writing the shitty first draft, I want you to, in the revision process, choose one section of writing at a time. And when I say one section of writing, if you're writing a dissertation, a standard 5-chapter dissertation, I don't mean I'm going to revise my lit review, pick one strand of literature, maybe the first strand of literature, which could have 5 or 6 different subheadings in it as a starting point, not your entire lit review. We want to make this as manageable as possible and break this down into small steps so that it feels more feasible for you. Conversely, if you're working on a manuscript, those are typically shorter. You could tackle an entire section, such as the introduction or the methods section. That would be a little more feasible than trying to revise an entire lit review that a master's or doc student would have to write. So once you have revisited your overarching argument, I want you to prioritize the revision process. I have a video tutorial on this on YouTube, the Dissertation by Design YouTube channel, if you want to see the whole thing in action. But essentially, you're starting with organization. And when I say organization, I'm referring to the structure of your paper, the headings. Does the content match the headings? Is there paragraph unity? And I start with organization because, as you can imagine, it doesn't really make sense to try to perfect the content, grammar, punctuation, transition sentences, tone, all of those things, if that material is going to move elsewhere. So I always start with organization. Then I move on to content. This is exactly what it sounds. This is the content of your paper. I tackle that second. And sometimes I have to go back and forth between content and organization before I move on to editing. And that's perfectly fine. It just kind of depends on A, what you're writing, and then B, where you are in the writing and revision process. But once you feel good about how the paper is organized and the content, then save editing for last. And this also applies for tackling feedback. So if you already have a draft, maybe perhaps you've already submitted a document for review and you've received feedback, and maybe there's a ton of comments and track changes and it's very overwhelming and you're not quite sure where to start. Go through all of that feedback and categorize it. Is this a comment about organization? Is this the comment about content? Is this a comment about editing? And do all of the organizational comments first, content second, editing third, and that'll give you a bit more of an action plan for tackling feedback. So this prioritization list goes for revision and for feedback. Let's talk about organization in a bit more detail. So even though you started with a detailed outline, you spent a lot of time pre-writing, there could still be issues with the structure and flow of material in your draft. That's perfectly fine. So I first assess organizational structure by creating a reverse outline. And the Writing Center at UNC Chapel Hill has a helpful resource on how to create a reverse outline. You can also Google reverse outline if you're not familiar. There's a lot of resources out there. Part of this reverse outlining process is assessing paragraph unity. This is something I do very frequently with my clients when they get feedback about organization. Is sometimes the content doesn't match the heading, and the way to look at that, or to make sure each paragraph flows or each paragraph is only addressing one topic, highlight the main idea in each paragraph. And as you're reading, if you see a different main idea come up, highlight that too. And that'll make it really easy to just look down the page to see where some of those issues are, so you can start moving information around. So now that you've kind of put everything in its right place, it's time to revise for content. I actually find this to be the most challenging revision category, because at this point you're probably extremely close to the material and it might not be obvious what content is missing or needs to be expanded upon or even is irrelevant. Sometimes you just have to wait until you get feedback from either a subject matter expert or a member of your committee or even a reviewer. Hopefully, if you're submitting to a journal, maybe you're working with a research team so you can get their thoughts on the content. The easiest actionable item on this list is figuring out if the content is aligned. So if you're not sure if something is missing or needs to be expanded upon or if it's irrelevant, I do think you can immediately start thinking about alignment of the content. And this is what I mean here. So this is an alignment table, and I use this, I feel like almost every day with either my students or my clients. In this example, I've copy and pasted some research questions and a purpose statement from a proposal into this table. So if I receive a proposal from someone, I'm immediately copying and pasting into an alignment table to see if the content is aligned. As you can see here in the notes column, I have the variables that I've underlined in the research questions and the purpose statement bulleted out, so it's really easy to compare them. The research questions have these very clear 3 variables that are being investigated. But as you can see in this example, the purpose statement, these variables are slightly different than the research questions. And when you look at it in a table like this, it makes it really obvious where there are issues with alignment. And as many of you know, if you've been working on a manuscript or you're writing a dissertation, when you're in the thick of the writing process, sometimes we get confused. We start to bring in similar or linked terms and throw them into our purpose statement. We often tend to have many different types of purpose statements. We'll have the purpose statement near the research questions, but then we'll also in other areas say the aim of this study, the objective of this study, the goal of this study. Those are all different types of purpose statements. And when you use different words, it's confusing to the reader. And if the words are not in alignment with other components of the research, such as the methodology, the research design, even the study population, it's really confusing for your reader. So in this instance, the student who submitted this proposal, the way they were operationalizing student achievement was with student math scores, which was in their methods chapter. But student math scores snuck into the purpose statement on the first page. And even though it's not wrong, it's confusing when the research question says student achievement. Similarly, in the lit review, this client was writing about the connection between student engagement and different classroom structures and student achievement. So student engagement kind of snuck into one of the purpose statements. Again, it can be confusing. So use a table like this to kind of pull out these core concepts, core components, of your research to assess whether or not there's alignment, if everything is matching up. I have another quick example here using key concepts from a problem statement. As you can see here at first glance, elementary school classroom structure, self-contained, departmentalized, and student achievement. These are in alignment with the research questions. But then this theory here, at first glance, I thought, I know the key concepts don't have to be the exact same, but it led to a more in-depth conversation with the student. But if I hadn't created this table, it might have been hard to see that. Same with the literature review themes. When I pulled out the headings and put them in a table, and this is an abbreviated version, I immediately honed in on students with disabilities. I thought, this is a study population that has not been mentioned thus far, so it's something that I needed to consider having a conversation with the student about. If I had just been reading from the top to bottom, I might have been 2 hours in at that part of the lit review and might have just glossed over it. So that's why it's helpful to use a table like this to assess the alignment in your content. So I encourage you to use something very simple like this for yourself. You don't have to show it to anyone else. You can just use it to start to evaluate your own writing. Oh, it's time for another poll. I'm curious to know.
I will get to that, and I'm very sorry to interrupt, but very excited. I got the link to where I put the link to the handout in the chat, so people have been able to download it. So go to the chat and you'll be able to download it. So thank you.
Okay.
All right, I'll go to the poll.
Yeah, I'm curious to know from you guys, how often are you editing while you're writing?
All right, just a couple more seconds to finish up the voting. All right, we'll close the poll and share it.
Yes. 59% of you always edit while you write. 35% sometimes, 6% never. Okay, I really want to flip this. So hopefully I can convince you by the end of this webinar to resist the urge to edit while you write, because it significantly slows down the writing process. So have that in mind. Think about the process that I showed you earlier in the presentation, where I started out editing and revising while I was writing, and it took a long time. It was extremely painful. It was not efficient. Whereas now I have trained myself over time to resist the urge to edit while I write. I do that at the end. I save that as a final step, and it can be extremely time consuming, but it's something that I focus all at once instead of doing it while I'm writing. So I could spend an entire day talking about editing, which is not the purpose of this presentation. So instead, I'm just going to touch on some editing issues and give you a few tips about how I approach the editing process. So once I've gone through the process of revising maybe multiple times for content and organization, then I'm ready to transition to editing. And for some folks, if you're an extremely strong writer and you've been writing for a long time, you've published many manuscripts, maybe you've written grants, then it might get to the point where you're unconsciously editing while you're writing because you're a strong writer, and so everything is just coming out a bit more polished. But if you're not, it can slow you down. So just save it, like I said, for the end. But start by reading aloud. I will often even print out a hard copy instead of editing on the computer, and I'll read the document aloud to myself, and that's extremely helpful for catching different editorial writing mechanics issues. Obviously, having your style guide handy is extremely important. So many of the clients I work with are with APA 7, especially with the transition from APA 6. We've all had to have our style guides handy. So when I think of style, I categorize that with editing, and I focus on that usually in it takes a few different passes, because you can't catch everything at once. Cohesion is also extremely important. I consider this to be a part of the editing process. When I was an undergraduate, I had so many issues with tense and voice. I was sometimes writing in future or present tense when I shouldn't be. I still overly use passive voice. It's something that I always have to look for and change to active voice. Tone is important with academic writing. We should be writing in a more formal, authoritative tone. And then person, first, second, third person. So when you're drafting, I encourage you to just get out what comes to mind. Don't try to check all of these off as you're writing. Instead, you might have to do a full read through just for tense, a full read through just for tone, a full read through just for voice. And as you can see, this can get very time consuming, but if you get in the habit of doing it this way, you will ultimately start to just automatically incorporate it into your writing correctly. So my issues with tense are kind of long gone. I just naturally write in the correct tense now because I went through years of editing for tense. So there's also precision and clarity. This is a really common one, is anthropomorphism, which is where you're attributing human behavior to non-living or inanimate objects. So just saying this chapter will describe, or this section will demonstrate. So kind of going and looking at those in one pass and looking for anthropomorphism to try to revise or edit just for that is extremely helpful, and I find that many students do need to do that. Also removing adverbs, using concrete and precise nouns and verbs. So for example, with a healthcare student, someone recently said in their writing, the patient's temperature was extremely high. Well, extremely is vague. I don't know what that means. So I look for ly words and I try to delete those and be more precise. What do you mean by extremely? State the exact temperature instead of saying extremely. So that's part of what I mean about that precision. And then correcting biased language. More and more people are becoming aware of the gender bias. They're changing pronouns to they. But there's also other types of bias that even Desi alluded to it yesterday in her presentation, where someone said something about a checkered past. Well, that's very unclear, and it sounds like it could be a bit biased. Something I see quite often are things like a scholar will say, surprisingly or interestingly, and then they'll give me some sort of information. And I'll say, let's replace surprisingly with being very exact and precise about what surprised you. If the findings are surprising because they conflict with the findings of another study, then just say that. Don't use the word surprising, because that can come off as biased. And then citations and references. I lump this into the editing process because even when you have a lot of experience with writing, typically you need to go through and do a full edit just with citations and references. And this does involve cross-checking, so making sure there's a one-to-one match and that everything is cited appropriately according to the style guide that you're using. And you can use a reference software such as Satavi to help you with this. I'm going to show you a quick example of a revised document. So I included a screenshot of a few revised and edited paragraphs from a portion of a document that we created months and months ago for one of our on-demand courses. And as you can see, there are a lot of track changes. The bottom paragraph is almost completely revised. The top section, the summary, also has quite a few track changes in it. And I'm sharing this with you just to kind of lift the veil on this perception that scholars, especially scholars who are well published or who have been, in academia for quite a while, that we just kind of produce these perfect drafts. We don't. This was something created by myself and another member of my team where we have a lot of experience, and we still had to go in with a heavy hand and do some revision and editing. And so it's perfectly fine for the final draft to look much different than what you planned. That's a normal part of the process. I just think it's incredibly intimidating, especially when I think back to when I first published a manuscript. I would see these, beautifully written articles in journals, and you just have no idea what goes into that. You haven't seen the many, many, many drafts that went through a team of researchers in order to get to that nice polished product. So just kind of give yourself some grace and allow yourself, just open up to this idea of significant revisions and editing. It's perfectly normal. So in order to aid you in that process of editing and revising, develop a checklist. Kind of pay attention to what you're prone to in your own writing, especially if you're getting feedback. Take clues from that feedback and add some of those things to your checklist. When I first started my checklist in grad school, it was much longer than this. I've whittled it down over time to where these are kind of the things that I'm constantly working on. Passive voice, for some reason, I just have a hard time with that. I always have to edit for passive voice. Anthropomorphism, subject-verb agreement, cross-checking citations and looking at headings, especially now that APA style has changed. Those have always been on my checklist. So think about what is your checklist. See if you can create one to start to streamline the editing process for yourself. I think you'll find it helpful. Many of my students do this, and so do my clients. And it's really helped them have a plan of attack when they go in to kind of edit and put the final touches on a draft. Okay, let's do one final poll before I get to my last slide. I'm just curious to hear from you guys. How often do you document revisions when responding to feedback? So if you get feedback from a chair, committee member, or even a reviewer, do you document and keep track of those revisions when you're responding?
All right, just a couple more seconds and I'll close the poll. Okay, I'm going to close now.
Oh, good. So 44% of you always document revisions, 37% sometimes, 19% never. So I'd love for all of you to be in the always category. I'm going to share an example of a table that I like to use. So this is a very basic table. Essentially, if you're on like a final draft and the feedback you're getting is minimal, you don't need to do this. But if you have just submitted a draft and you've received extensive feedback from either a reviewer or someone on your committee, it's incredibly helpful not just for you, but also for the reviewer to receive a table that documents their comments and your responses to those comments. I encourage you to document the page number, even the line number, if that's possible, and add your response. Either check it off as completed, or if you're a student and you're in a learning situation, let the reviewer know what you're struggling with. One of my pet peeves is when a student will say, hey, here's my chapter 2, or here's my chapter 4, and they just give it to me. I want to hear from you. I know that there's something that you struggled with, something that you're second guessing. So let your reviewer know that up front if you're in an educational setting. And you can also push back. So you might not agree, or you might not be sure about the comment, and so you can add a response in the table. This makes it so much easier to digest as a reviewer and as a student to make sure you didn't miss something. Than going through a paper that has a ton of track changes and comments. It can be really hard to keep track of those. And if it's a situation where you've submitted a manuscript to a journal and you have several reviewers who've responded, create a separate table for each reviewer so you can keep those separated, and that'll make it a lot easier for your reviewers as well. Highly recommended. Almost every faculty member I talk to, and as a reviewer at a journal, we always appreciate these tables. So if you're a student, I highly recommend that you get in the habit of doing this now. And if you're currently, a professor and you're submitting articles to journals, I also encourage you to use this when you're responding to your reviewers. Whew, that was a lot of information that I just threw at you. I hope you found this presentation helpful. When in the handout that Stacy shared with you, there are links to some of the resources. I encourage you to check those out. And of course, if you have any questions or you need support, feel free to reach out to me or my team at Dissertation by Design. Now I'm going to hand it over to Jenny and Laura to do the NVivo and Satavi demonstration.
Great, Jessica. That was excellent. And I shared questions with you, so you can, while they're demonstrating, you can read through that and pick a few to answer at the end. All right, so I'm going to make Jenny our presenter. Or Jenny, do you want me to show the PowerPoint first on what you're going to talk about?
That's okay. I can just.
I'll make you presenter then.
All right. So what I'm going to talk about now is Satavi, and my focus will be on using it as a pre-writing tool and using Satavi to help you build some writing momentum. And we'll look at revision a little bit as well, but the focus will be more on those kind of first steps of the writing process. Hopefully you can see my screen. Maybe I should check that. Okay, good. So here, this looks pretty empty, and that's because this is a pretty new research project that I've started. So I'm looking at the relationship between boredom and creativity during periods of quarantine. And I've just set up a really simple outline for myself to start. This doesn't need to be final by any means. It's just kind of what you know is going to go into your paper. And then, maybe you've already started doing a little bit of reading and you have some studies and, you have a few different studies from different places, and that's going to be a focus in your paper. So I've just set up these simple categories. I have a few studies that I brought into, or articles that I brought into my project. And now, if I wanted, I could also add those articles to the categories just to keep things nice and organized. And for example, this one here, it's a study in China. I can just drag that into that category as well. And then when I'm going through the different articles and taking notes, I can already start thinking about where something is going to go in my outline. So I'll just give you an example of that. So we'll just take a few notes from our article that we have here. And so you're going along and reading, and then you see something like this statement here, and you say, I want to save that as a direct quotation because that's a definition that I want to make sure that I have for later on. And you are prompted here to add a core statement. That just means kind of a summary of the text that you've saved. Oops. And then I would already start adding that to my category system. And I could look at that here if I didn't remember it and just check it, or you can start typing it and then just press the tab button. I know this is my study that took place in China. And then I'll just click OK. And if Satavi were able to find the page number in the metadata, it would add it automatically. But here I'll just add this first one, and then the next quotation that I save, it will remember the page I'm on and add it automatically. Okay, so we have that there. You're not going to just be adding only quotes when you're reading, just like in the session yesterday, for those who took part, you'll want to focus on paraphrasing and kind of keeping track of your own thoughts on the text. And so for that, let's just have another example. So here, for example, these are some factors that influence quarantine boredom. So I'll just add that as a comment, and you'll see that Satavi gives you kind of an automatic core statement, but usually you'll want to change that unless you're trying to just go through a paper or something really quickly, and then you'll go back to it later. But this does help you later on when you're sorting through all of your different pieces of information. And here then I can add my comment on the text here. And so maybe I think that they left out one of the factors. So I'll just say, I'm not sure why the authors, whoops, don't discuss factor X. And you can see this is not, these notes are just notes. They're not something that you're going to be publishing, but yeah. And Satavi will let you know also if the quote page range is out of the range for the source. So that looks like something, yeah. This is one of these open source journals, and so sometimes with adding those, the article number comes into the page range field, so just change that and update this here so that we have the right numbers. And if we go back to the quotations, so we now have this comment we made on the text, we have this this definition looking at the difference between the two types of boredom. We could add maybe one more thing. Let's find an image. So let's just use the image tool, and let's say that this is important to what we want to say about the two different types of creativity and how the study measured them. And I can change this caption here as I want it to be. And then this later would appear as the caption in my Word document when I'm writing, if I wanted to include this image. Okay, and I can add that as well to a category. So I'll add that there. If you forget, it's not a problem because when you go to the knowledge organizer, that's where you'll see all of these different pieces of information. So here I can look at the one that I didn't yet categorize and move that also into this area here. And when you're going through and thinking about how things fit together, you can view different items together in the preview pane. Sometimes juxtaposing these items in this way can lead to new thoughts, which you can add here. Sometimes it might cause you to think of a way that you might want to formulate the introduction to a section, and you can use the thought for that as well. So you can do a lot of pre-writing work already in Satavi, which then kind of takes the pressure off when you have to start writing. And to show you that, I'm just going to bring up our demo project, which has a lot more information in it than this project we just created. So this one is on food fraud and food quality. And if we look at the knowledge organizer here, well, this is the all view. That's not very helpful. It just looks like a big mess. So let's get into our categories here. And then you can see that you have the different items and you have them then subdivided a bit. So I'd have my section where I'm talking about how it's hard to define the terms. I have some ideas I've saved, and then I would go on and discuss some of these other definitions. All of that you can bring to Word and insert. And for those who took part yesterday, I showed you the chapters view, which you get when you insert just the outline for your paper. There is another feature in Satavi that you can use to kind of get an overview of where you are and to jumpstart the writing process. And that is this insert categories and knowledge items option, and then you would leave this checkbox checked, and we'll say all categories. And Satavi is going to put everything that you've collected and organized in your Satavi project into this Word document, and then you'll have that all at your fingertips. And sometimes we show this and students will say, well, usually undergrad students will say, oh, Satavi's just going to write my paper for me. And that's definitely an oversimplification, because if you just have pieces of information and quotes and you just string them together with a sentence or two, that's not going to make for a very good paper. So usually if I were writing, I would start with, I would just insert my outline and use this chapters view, which I'll show you in a second once it's populated all of the information in the document. And what that lets you do is it lets you see everything that you've gathered, and it's in the nice structure like you see here, and you can preview it down at the bottom, but then you can rephrase things in your own words, and you're not as, you don't already have that full quotation like here in your paper. So I think it makes for a little bit better writing flow to just kind of have everything to refer to on the left rather than having it front and center and already in your paper. But everyone's a bit different, and this can be very, very helpful if you just struggle to start writing and you look at that blank page and you're like, oh, I have no idea what to say. So when you've done some of that pre-work in Satavi and really thought about how things fit together, and then you just use these 2 clicks to put everything into your paper, you see, oh, I have quite a lot of information. And then sometimes seeing it together, you can start thinking about how things fit together a bit better than you might be able to in your project, where it's more of a hierarchical category system. You can see where you have holes. So this section here, I have no information on. And if I'm more advanced in my project, maybe I'll realize, oh, yeah, this is kind of outside the scope of what I want to talk about anyway. So this is a good tool to just give you an idea of where you're at and maybe how you might want to revise the structure of your paper as well. All right, I'm going to undo all of that. and show you then how I would usually use this feature to write. And it's the same option here, but then I would uncheck the include knowledge items box and go to all categories. And then I just have all my categories inserted, and I'm going to change that layout so I have some chapter numbering. And then here, now when I go in, I can use this chapters view. You see, otherwise you have the references. So those are all your sources, and you have all the pieces of information you've saved. So your own comments, your own ideas, and any direct quotations or paraphrases you've saved, any summaries. And then in this chapters view, when you put the cursor in the chapter, you'll notice that it changes. So you see just the information you have for that particular section, and you can stay very focused. And then it's just a matter of going in, and you'll probably have some other notes as well, but you have the ones that you took in Satavi here. You can look at in the preview what that quotation was, or you can see your idea that you had. You can just double click to insert some text that you have. And let me change that. That's a little distracting with the language. Just change that to English. So you can just go along then and insert things. And when you come to the process of revising, you might say something like, oh, well, this direct quotation looks a little bit funny. Those page numbers look strange. You have this link symbol over here, and you can jump back to that context in Satavi. So I can go to, whoops, right click again, edit in Satavi. And have too many projects open. That should be the right one. Yeah, so then you have that link you can jump back to in the document. And this looks a little bit small. You can, of course, always move things around and magnify, so that's a little bit easier to see. So that's quite handy if you ever need to go back and check something. And here I could also, you can also right click on the citation itself and go to edit in Satavi. And then here I would check the reference information. I see, oh yeah, this actually is a document that has just kind of funny page numbering. I can even see it here. Okay, so that's all good. Yeah, so that can save you quite a bit of time, especially a lot of times when you're revising, you might want to go back to the original source and see yeah, what the surrounding context was, because maybe your notes are a little bit vague, or that you just had like a one sentence quotation and you don't know any longer. Yeah, you want to know maybe a little bit more before you make a statement about it in your paper. So that's quite handy. The other thing is if you're citing something often in your paper, and let's maybe use this one here. Like any citation tool, Satavi just lets you insert references, of course, as well. So, you might have your sentence here, and then you just need the reference. And you can just insert that, and it'll insert it according to the rules of your citation style, which you can pick here. And so I'll just go ahead and change that to APA. It's always good. A lot of people, when they use reference management software, they think, oh, the tool's going to do everything perfectly. I don't even need to think about it. When I import my sources into the program, everything's going to be fine. And then when they're getting close to the deadline and they look over their list of references, they see, oh, that looks strange, or that looks strange. So it's definitely also good to build into the revision process some time to go through and double check that the information you have in your Satavi project is how you want it to be. because sometimes things can happen where you import from a database and Satavi just takes that metadata. So you know, it's not, yeah, it doesn't have a brain. It can't say, oh, that looks strange. It'll just accept whatever metadata you bring in from a database, or if you're using a ID search like an ISBN from a book or something like that. So that is another thing to think about before you get too far along in your project, and you can check that you've checked the original source against the information in your project, and you can then put your name and initials. So that's something we recommend, is maybe creating a task for yourself for all of the references in your project. You can do that quite easily in Satavi as well, just by creating a task for everything at once or a subset. And here I would just give myself this task to take a look at that bibliographic information. One of the less glamorous tasks, but always useful to do, just so that you don't get any surprises at the end. And that's whatever reference management tool you're using. So if you do use something other than Satavi, yeah, just don't assume the tool is magic. Yeah, so jumping back into our document now, one thing I wanted to show you is if you need to change, for example, an author name. So let's say we cite Opara a few times. I'll cite them also in a different format here. So we'll use that format and start the sentence with them as shown X, Y, Z. And we'll maybe add a reference to them here. So let's say that you realize at some point, oh, that year is wrong for that article. I don't know what I was thinking. I totally screwed that up. And you know, these three references we have to this one paper, that's just across 2 pages. But what if you have a 100-page document or a 200-page document and would need to go through? I mean, you can use the find and replace in Word, of course. But yeah, this just kind of makes it a little bit easier to update everything all at once. So you can go back into Satavi and then edit your study. And so here I have my one that I was looking at, and let's say that I realized that year was wrong. So let's make sure that that saves before jumping back in. That automatically updates then all over and also in your bibliography at the end. So that's just a very quick overview of how Satavi can help you. Of course, the revision process, you'll do a lot of the things that Jessica showed you, just like in any other Word document, you know, any other paper. But Satavi can really help with those pre-writing steps. And then it also just helps you keep everything very consistent throughout, since you're always inserting the citations through the program. So there's less of an option for error on your part. Yeah, and you can also always at the end, because these are fields that are linked up with your Satavi project, if you need to submit to a journal that doesn't want that, that's quite easy to change. You just go to convert, and then you can save a copy of your document as static text. And any kind of final last minute things where you don't want to be jumping back into your project, you can change in that as well. So some people like editing that way as well. So that's yeah, that's about it from me then. A very quick overview. And if you have any questions, just ask them in the question section, and I'll try to get to all of them.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And I also put a link in the chat to the Satavi website so people can see that. You can get a trial of Satavi. And also people are asking about Mac. So if you have a Mac, Satavi Web would be what you'd want to trial, because it's cloud-based, so you'd be able to access it. All right, I'm going to make Laura our next presenter about NVivo.
Hello, everyone, and looking forward to showing you how we might be able to bring these things together in NVivo, thinking about how you're going to do your revisions and your alignment from your literature and also your from your data analysis. So Stacy, can you confirm you're seeing NVivo now?
Yes, I am.
Great, thanks so much. So one of the things that I wanted to show you is that NVivo has a sample project built into it, and I like to use that for the demonstrations because this is something that you can come back to, play around with, think about how they did this in the sample project, and whether or not you might want to do similar things yourself. Today, I'm going to use the Environmental Change Down East project, which has been part of the NVivo samples for years and years and years. It was a real research project done for multiple purposes, including being a permanent demo with NVivo. So when we think about what Jessica was recommending, thinking about alignment of your research questions with the way you're writing, and what Jenny was saying, alignment of your categories with your literature, you know, similarly, you want to align your data structures eventually with your research questions and so on. And so one of the things that I wanted to show you in NVivo is you can align your code structure and move it around. It's very flexible, malleable, and you can have your coding structure eventually align with the writing and your research questions. So you've got everything put together in kind of an order that makes sense to you. Now, it probably won't look like that in the beginning, and that's okay, but that's what you're working towards. So I wanted to show you the coding structure that's been set up, and this environmental change project is what I would call a mature project. It's had lots of coding in it. They've been in their data for a long time and are probably getting ready to start writing up. And in this code structure, you can see that there is hierarchy. So on the blue pane on the left-hand side is the list of the folders and items that are in the project. And I'm right now in the main codes folder. And you can see if I open the plus signs, there are some subcodes, which are kind of topics of this main theme. So under, for instance, sense of community down east, I'm going to see 3 topic codes that inform that theme. One of the things I often encourage people to do when they're working in NVivo is when they're creating codes, which is the places that we put pieces of our data that belong together. So everything in our local connection code would be about local connection. And one of the things that you can do is actually include a description or something like a definition of what belongs in that code. And if you do that consistently, then it starts to act like a code book for what you have in your project. And I find that exporting your code book with these descriptions at regular intervals really helps you start to think about how are these codes aligning, what do I think belongs in these codes. And a code book is very shareable with other people. So you can actually go to NVivo, I want to go to the Share tab and export the code book. And I'm going to just have it export my main code list. And I can, if you see down here, include the number of files and references that I've got with that code. And I'm going to put that on my desktop, but what is generated is a Word document that then produces a list of all of the codes in my project and what they are using as a definition. And this can be a very helpful tool to help you think about what are the things that I have in these codes, how do they align with my research question, which pieces of literature or which literature categories, how are these all fitting together? So you should see now the Word document and the code book. And what I find also very helpful is exporting this code book over multiple periods in your project so that you start to track what your codes look like at certain stages, how that was aligning not so well at the beginning perhaps, but how it moved over time. And if you save those code books, you can actually have what I call an audit trail, or as part of the audit trail that demonstrates the progression of your thinking. And I often even create in my data files a folder for my code books. So that's one thing to start thinking about. And those code books actually become very helpful tools in helping you think about what belongs in these codes, how do they need to change, and so on. But what's even more important, I think, is the ability to be able to track your thoughts about the data analysis. And again, when you're doing that reflection process that Jessica spoke about, and wanting to think about how the codes are changing and tracking that, you can create what are called memos in NVivo. And memos are under the notes section. And one of the things about memos is they're exportable. So that becomes very, very helpful. They're exportable as Word documents, and you can track in there your thoughts about the progress of the topic, where the topic might fit with certain themes, what you're not sure about, what you might want to ask questions of your committee about, and so on. So you can have folders set up within your memos folder as well. So you might have some folders here for each of your sections of memos that you might want. So this folder has team memos, and you can see that this person had a research journal where she is tracking her thoughts about certain things. You can also have memos to track your team process and include in there some of the visualizations that you have. And then this all helps you with that reflection part, so that as you're going to start your writing, you can start pulling into these memos, and you can export the memos as a Word document, and that becomes another piece of information that you can potentially put in the outline, either as Jenny showed you, adding it to that kind of outline, or checking the alignment with the alignment table that Jessica talked about. So the really cool thing about doing these kinds of memos in Windows version of NVivo is that you can also put in links to the data or links to other places in the project that are called See Also links. And See Also links take a quote or help you link to items in your project. And if you export your memo, you can export it including the See Also link. And when you open that memo, after it exports, the link to the relevant piece of text that you have there opens as a little footnote. And I'm just looking to see, here it comes up. And you should be able now to see my memo being exported as a Word document, and then being the See Also link to the quote at the bottom. So these memos exported that are about certain topics or about your thoughts as the research is developing can be very helpful as you start to write. You've got some rough material now from your literature potentially, as Jenny showed, and now you've got your thoughts as they're progressing in your analysis, and you also have then material to help you start doing the draft of your paper. So part of checking your analysis and your coding and the alignment with your research questions, so you usually reach a stage where you're not sure if certain codes belong together and so on. So let's say I'm looking at the codes that I have set up. I'm going to go back here to Sense of Community Down East. And you're not sure if some of the things that you have coded here overlap a lot, or do they belong closely to community change? How do these things fit together? And is there some kind of overlap in my coding and so on? Do I need to check that, and what would I do? So one of the queries that can be very helpful in NVivo is something called a matrix coding query. And in a matrix coding query, I had this one set up already. You can put together different codes and actually check to see which things have been coded in both places, let's say. So on the rows of this matrix that I have here at the bottom, I've got local connection as one of my codes. and local knowledge, local identity, and then this is the theme code for community change. And this query shows me what is coded both at local connection and community change. And I can see that there's a number of references here, but if I double click in the cell, it actually shows me what the content is that's coded there. So perhaps as I'm beginning my writing and I'm starting to be thinking about how I'm going to differentiate those themes, then being able to come in and see what is coded at both of those places and what's in common about them and what's not can be a very helpful part of that writing process. So the last thing I wanted to show you is that something similar to this matrix coding query where you can start to see overlap of things. But in NVivo for Windows, you can also do a similar kind of exercise using what is called a framework matrix. And in a framework matrix, you can take information that is coded at certain cases, which is in this example, each case is actually one of the interview participants in the data. And it's taking a minute to open, there we go. What I can see here is a summary of my interviewees, and I've got it arranged by which community they live in, and then what I've actually have coded from them at that theme called sense of community. And I can summarize by each of my interviewees what has been coded there. And in this part of the matrix, I can begin to take notes and summarize what I'm thinking about what I'm seeing in this data. And this framework matrix then can be exported so you have one more kind of way of thinking about the summary of the data that you're finding about a certain theme and what you've written about it in each of your interview participants. And if I found a certain quote here that I thought was very interesting, I could potentially then link it to this piece of the note that I had done a summary for by creating a new summary link. And then this actually links that part of my thought to this piece of the data. So I hope you're starting to see then that by thinking about how your coding structure aligns with your research questions, using that alignment table, potentially adding in a similar, let's say, numbering system, and the categories that Jenny showed from Satavi, how you can bring those all together by having your coding structure match up with that kind of structure, keeping notes about it. You can link memos, for instance, to a certain code, like this theme code of sense of community down east, build your notes about the code and quotes that are relevant to it, export those as Word documents, which then give you the basis for that piece of your report. So Stacy, that's it for me. I'll hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. That was great. So what's exciting is to see how the tools we showed today can help just help you organize and work within your writing process with what Jessica showed you. So I'm just going to go over some resources that can help everyone. And then if we have time, we can take a few questions. Sorry, from current slide. Okay, so here is a link to Dissertation by Design services, and you can see all the different ways they can help you with your writing. And this is just showing you how you can use Satavi and NVivo with your writing process. So I won't go through this, but it's in the handout that now everyone hopefully got. And to try Satavi, I added this link, but you can try it with the Windows or with Satavi Web, which works with Windows and Mac. And then to try NVivo, I also sent a link in the chat to get to the trial for NVivo, but this is just showing you all our different products that can help you with your research process. And here's some free resources that can help you learn NVivo, and then NVivo Academy is our courses that we offer. I'm part of the community with QSR, and so we'd love it if you want to join the community. Some upcoming events for the community, we're obviously this Writing Institute, but our virtual conference in September, and our call for abstracts are due June 30th, so we'd love it if you would want to submit your abstract and be part of the conference. And we're going to announce our early career research grant soon, which is worth $25,000 over 2 years. Right now, we're looking for reviewers for that. So with that, I will just go to maybe Jessica. Do you want to take one question that you found people wanted to talk about or get an answer for?
Sure. I had several wonderful questions. Let me go through really quickly and see if I can pick one. Several of you asked about anthropomorphism and passive versus active voice, and I sent you a few resources. Instead of talking about that, I just recommend that you familiarize yourself with your style guide. So APA 7 has very specific guidance about both. So if you're using a different style guide, go to that style guide to see what the requirements are. So for APA 7, for instance, they highly recommend using first person, and by doing that, it makes it a lot easier to avoid active voice and use, avoid passive voice and use active voice. But some programs, I know some of our doc students are in programs where they're told that they can't use first person, and that can make it a little more challenging to use active voice, but I think you should familiarize yourself with your style guide. Adrian asked a good question about what if the reviewer's comments are more macroscopic in nature, such as coherence or alignment, that oftentimes cannot be fully captured in a revision table? And that's a good question, because sometimes reviewers' comments are not specific to a line in a manuscript or a dissertation or a thesis. And so in that case, you might have a longer response in that response table. You might say, thank you for expressing concerns about the argument. My core argument is this. It has been clarified in this section. Or if there's a comment about organization and it's incredibly vague and you're not sure what to do, but you have an idea, you could explain your thought process behind how you reorganized the way you did. And that kind of connects to one other question that I thought was interesting. I can't find who said it, but I remembered it was, do you always have to use track changes, especially if there are significant revisions? And I have two thoughts about that. One is no. If you're doing a lot of cutting and pasting, it can make it really hard to follow everything with track changes on. So in that case, if it's really extensive, then you'll just be resubmitting a new draft anyways, and you can let the person know, if it's a chair or committee member, that you've reorganized, and they'll just have to read the whole document. But if it's in a couple of areas, then you can just turn off track changes and highlight those changes so it's easier to read, instead of having, the document look, it's hard to follow when you've done a lot of cutting and pasting to follow the track changes. Yeah, that's all I have. I want to be thoughtful of our time.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and I know, don't worry, you will get, if the handout is in the chat link, but we will be sending an email early next week with all the recordings and all the links to the handout. So we will get those to you, and we just want to say thanks to Jessica, Jenny, and Laura for great presentations today, and hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow.
Thanks everyone.
Bye everyone.
Bye, thank you.